Hello friends, let me set the scene. It's 1997. The internet is an established, if still relatively new, part of contemporary culture. GeoCities is the 5th most popular website on the web. The word cyber is spiking in popularity, and the Nancy Drew Files number 124, Crime at the Chat Cafe, is hitting bookshelves. Yes, Nancy's on the net, and there's danger online. That's the real tagline for this book. Just look at their faces on the cover. Those are the faces of people discovering that there's danger online for the very first time. As you might have guessed from the title, the book is set in an internet cafe, or as the book calls it, a cyber cafe, because that's a cooler name than internet cafe. Internet cafes have seen a steady decline in popularity since 2008, so if you don't know what an internet cafe is, I'll tell you. It's a cafe at which you can use the internet. Okay, with that out of the way, why are we talking about crime at the Chat Cafe? Well, I read it recently and I had a lot of fun reading it. Yeah, that's the reason. But this is also the very last book in the Nancy Drew Files series, so it has historical significance. This is through no real fault in the Files series itself. Apparently in the late 90s, the popularity of all Nancy Drew series were beginning to wane, so Simon & Schuster decided to cancel all the spin-off series which were aimed at older readers. But before the series ended for good, readers were given one last great gift. Crime at the Chat Cafe. So let me tell you what this book is about. Before we get any further, I have to tell you that chat is spelled with an @ symbol instead of an A. Okay, on with the synopsis. Nancy, Bess, and George have come to Santa Monica, California to help open the Chat Cafe. The brainchild of Lydia Rojas, the Chat Cafe is a real hot spot, the perfect place to sip coffee and surf the internet. But this is one ride on the information superhighway that's about to spin out of control. Someone knocks out Lydia's computer system and knocks out Nancy for asking too many questions, combining old-fashioned detective work with some cutting-edge cyber sleuthing. Nancy's out to snare the phantom hacker on the web before the computer saboteur downloads total disaster on Lydia and the cafe. I'm so ready for some cutting-edge cyber sleuthing. Chapter 1 starts with Nancy, Bess, and George catching a flight to Santa Monica. George, in a completely natural way, and not at all as if she's introducing the potentially ignorant reader to the concept of an internet cafe, says, "I love the whole cyber cafe concept. Relax with a couple friends, knock back a latte, and surf the internet, all at the same time." "What's this relaxing bit?" Nancy joked. "We're going to be up to our elbows in coffee grounds and keyboards." Be prepared for many other adorable turns of phrase like this one from a ghostwriter who appears to only have a transient grip on what a computer is. Oh, and that isn't a dig. I genuinely think it's adorable. A flight attendant passes by and asks Bess if she wants some coffee. "Only if it's served up by a computer geek," Bess said, smiling. A man across the aisle from Bess picked up the joke from there. "Yeah, and hold the cream and sugar. Just bring me a net connection with that." The flight attendant smiled in confusion. This poor man, he's just trying to do his job, and they're lobbing internet lingo back and forth over his head as if they're competing to be the hippest passenger on the flight. The male passenger then asks, "What is a cyber cafe?" as if George hadn't told us what it was just one page ago. But don't worry, if you're still confused, Nancy has an even more detailed explanation for us. "It's pretty amazing," she said. "These cafes are popping up everywhere. You go in for a cup of coffee, and instead of flipping through a magazine or something while you sip a cappuccino, you surf the net. The cafe supplies the modems, the computers, everything the customer needs to log on to other computers all over the world." "It's great," George added. "You can visit people on their websites and get to know them." "Interesting," the man said, "but I just use the web for business." "Work schmirk," Bess said. "Anyway, Bess, you'll be glad to hear that Nancy's father volunteered your free labor to help the daughter of one of his college buddies set up her cyber cafe. That's what you meant by work schmirk, right? That you'd rather not get paid for your efforts?" The girls arrive in Santa Monica and take a cab to the location of the Chat Cafe, a quaint little shopping district with chic boutiques lining the street. The cafe itself is a vintage building which had been transformed into a high-tech, new-age gathering place. Stucco siding had been painted a deep, regal purple with sparkling golden trim, and crystalline awnings shaped like bubbles topped the front door and windows. This description reminds me of mid-2000s Polly Pocket playsets in the best way. There's a painter up on a scaffold working on the trim, and as the girls watch, the scaffold wobbles and one of the ropes snaps. Of course, Nancy makes use of her parkour skills and manages to save the painter, whose name is Eric. Eric held Nancy's gaze for a moment, his green eyes suddenly reminding Nancy of her boyfriend, Ned Nickerson. Instinctively reaching for the gold, heart-shaped locket Ned had given to her, Nancy smiled, thinking of her habit of toying with it every time she thought of him. Eye contact with another man is basically cheating, you know. Quick, Nancy, remind yourself that you're faithful to your precious boyfriend, Ned Nickerson. The girls then meet the owner of the Chat Cafe, Lydia Rojas, and Nancy notices that the scaffolding rope appears to have been sawn through. Clearly sabotage. When the scaffold fell, Eric's paint spilled all over Nancy and her friends and ruined their clothes. Fortunately, Eric's sister owns a boutique called Trendy's, with an I instead of a Y, because Ys were uncool in the 90s. We're lucky they didn't rename Nancy Nancy Drew. The girls go on a shopping spree at Trendy's, buying all the latest fads, like a black and red embroidered vest for Nancy and a baby doll t-shirt for Bess. They all return to the Chat Cafe to find the computers all turned on when they shouldn't be. Lydia immediately blames her assistant, Andy Nile. Are you kidding me? Andy Nile? Andy Nile? That is the most obviously suspicious name I've ever heard. Suddenly, all the lights go out. Nancy goes outside to the back alley to investigate and gets bopped on the head and falls unconscious. This seems to happen at least once every Nancy Drew book. Like, I seriously think Nancy should go to the doctor to see if there's any permanent effects of the head trauma she incurs every week. Nancy wakes to a stranger who smells spicy, holding a knife to her throat. Someone bought into the Old Spice advertising. The stranger carries Nancy into another room where she promptly passes out, probably due to her traumatic brain injury. She wakes up the next morning in the pantry of the Chat Cafe, or as everyone calls it from this point onwards, the Chat. She tries telling the others what happened to her, but they don't believe her. "Nan," Bess said, "you got beaned by an industrial-sized can of tomatoes." Better than being tomatoed by an industrial-sized can of beans. Nancy's introduced to Andy Nile, a young man who wore his straight brown hair parted in the middle. It looked wet, as if it had been just shampooed or gelled. Andy may be the head geek around here, but he sure doesn't seem like one, Bess said. You know how most programmers don't communicate well because they only speak computer languages? Bess smiled and said, "Andy's different." Oh, Andy's not a regular geek. He's a cool geek. You know how most geeks are total losers who've talked to more computers than they have women? Yeah, Andy's not like that. Andy may be a cool geek, but Nancy also thinks he's a suspicious geek and wonders if he was the person who attacked her. The girls head back to Lydia's place to get some sleep as they were up all night searching for Nancy. Nancy has trouble sleeping, however, and she gets up and finds Lydia crying. "If I open the Chat Cafe," Lydia whispered, "somebody's going to die." "Sorry, who will die?" "Oh, just somebody." Nancy asks Lydia if she has any enemies, and Lydia names a competing cyber cafe called PC Corral, which is owned by a man named Rick Henry, and her ex-boss, Ellen Dorman, from when she worked in corporate programming. Then they all return to the chat, and Nancy is enlisted to help Andy with the cafe's website. As they sit down at the computer, Andy says, "So, Red, where do you want to begin?" Nancy looked at Andy. "I go by Nancy," she said. "Okay." "What is this, the riot act?" Andy asked. Oh yeah, Andy's so cool and hip with his searingly contemporary references to things such as a British Act of Parliament from 1714. Andy typed in a web address that brought up a swirling psychedelic screen. "Welcome to Santa Monica's newest cyber spot," Nancy read aloud. "Have a virtual mochaccino now and join us for the real stuff this Monday at the Chat Cafe." "I haven't finished yet," Andy explained. "We're planning to provide jumps to chat rooms and online game sites." "Will the chat have its own gaming team?" Nancy asked. "We hope so." Andy's fingers pelted the keyboard, causing different screens to load and flash. "Zero Dust," Nancy read. "What's this?" "The hottest network game around." Andy jumped to a game in progress so they could watch. "It came out about a month ago. We hope to go head-to-head with other cyber teams." Nancy Drew competes in an esports tournament. Who could have predicted that? I think this is the closest we've come to having a Nancy Drew book about video games, which is a shame, especially since the Hardy Boys have had at least 4. Nancy Drew fans clearly have an interest in video games, or there wouldn't be 33, soon to be 34, Her Interactive Nancy Drew games. If you're listening, Mr. Simon & Schuster, please give us a Nancy Drew book about video games. I bet she could finally get to the bottom of what's up with that Herobrine guy. Also, if you're curious as to what a network game is, it's basically the same idea as an online game, but run on a local network, such as the computers at the Chat Cafe. After Nancy and Andy finish the website, the girls take a break and head to the beach with Andy. Andy knew his way around the beach as well as he knew his way around the computer. Oh yeah, Andy's a cool geek. He can talk to women. He goes outside. Andy whips out a stunt kite and whips off his leather jacket to show Bess some of his moves. Who wears a leather jacket to the beach? That's a red flag. Seeing Andy's bare forearms naturally makes Nancy think about Ned, because it's pretty unfaithful to look at another man's arms when you have a boyfriend. And that's when Nancy realizes that the locket Ned gave her is gone. If it took her this long to notice, I don't think the locket's really that important to her. The locket wasn't expensive, but Ned had given it to her, and it meant a lot to Nancy. I can't believe Ned is such a cheapskate that he wouldn't even buy his long-term girlfriend a decent piece of jewelry. Ned is endlessly disappointing. When Nancy, Bess, and George get back to Lydia's house, Nancy mentions being suspicious of Andy. "Just what are you saying Andy is guilty of?" Bess raised her voice. "Cutting Eric's scaffold ropes? Knocking you out? Threatening Lydia?" "Oh, please, not this again." I have read so many Nancy Drew books now in which either Bess or George fall in insta-love with one of the suspects and immediately forget all loyalty they ever had to Nancy, instead becoming unreasonably defensive of a man they met one day ago. Starting to get a little tired of it. Bess says, "Why can't you accept people at face value instead of seeing everyone you meet as a potential suspect?" You know, she has a point. Isn't that the whole conceit of the Nancy Drew books, to judge every new character based on how suspicious they are? Lydia's phone rings and Nancy jumps to answer it, but it goes to the answering machine before she can get there. "Chris here in Chicago," a man's voice said. "Just calling to wish you luck on your grand opening tomorrow, Lyd. Any hope for us?" The sound of passing cars and machinery in the caller's background made it impossible for Nancy to understand his last few words. Before he hung up, Nancy heard the distinct sound of a bell ringing in the background. I also make all my important calls from a bell factory next to a 6-lane highway. Nancy then sits down to study the printouts of all of Lydia's previous threatening emails. Email 1. "The cafe is doomed. Don't go through with it." Email 2. "You know it. I know it. Soon everyone will know it. You're a failure. Just leave town." Email 3. "You aren't the only one at risk. Get out now, or your little helpers will go down with you." Little helpers? That's awfully whimsical for a threatening letter. I think the sender has confused an internet cafe with Santa's workshop. They probably need Nancy and George to explain the concept to them a few more times. The 4th message is my favorite. Email 4. "You have a thick head." You better hope it will save you when the walls come tumbling down. Oh yeah, they got Lydia real bad with that one. Your head is more dense than average. Back at the chat, Lydia has received a new threatening email. You've foolishly ignored my warnings. Open the doors tomorrow and all your dreams will go up in smoke. Who is this loser? I'm smoking him out. Andy ran into the cafe, with Bess and George right behind him. From the office, Nancy could see the two girls standing by as Andy pounded away at the keyboard. Better watch out. Andy's on Reddit. Andy eventually traces the email to the PC Corral, the rival cyber cafe. I don't know enough about technology, either modern or of the 1990s, to say whether this is plausible or not, but I will say the book keeps its cards very close to its chest when it comes to describing how the characters actually utilize their tech. They love to throw around words like HTML, coded, software, and connectors, but it's debatable as to whether whoever wrote this book actually had a good grasp on computers, or if they just read one issue of PC Magazine and called it a day. The gang head over to PC Corral to investigate the source of the email. The coffee house wasn't packed with customers, but a number of people were pecking away at their keyboards or sipping from mugs. A split-rail fence surrounded the computers and tables. Oh, so it's literally a corral. No wonder they don't have many customers if they're literally treating them like cattle. This place looks like a family steakhouse. Nancy nodded to a rack of antlers mounted on the wall. It has none of the chat's futuristic appeal. No insult has ever been more cutting than "this looks like a family steakhouse." A man dressed like a cowboy approached them. "Howdy, I reckon y'all are looking for a table for two," he said, with a Texas twang. Is that accent a job requirement? 'Cause you know what just makes sense? Cowboys and computers. A timeless combination, much like peanut butter and jelly. Nancy requests to see the PC Corral's email log, but the cowboy says he has to ask his boss, who won't be in until the next evening. After, there's another classic Nancy Drew scene. The brakes in Lydia's car stop working and it crashes into the ocean. Luckily, everyone is okay, because the only fatal accident in the Nancy Drew universe is the one which killed Nancy's mother. Sorry, that might be taking things too far. The next day, Nancy asks Lydia about Chris Toth, the man who left the voice message. Apparently, Chris and Lydia used to date when they were both professors at a Chicago university, but broke up after Lydia discovered that Chris had taken credit for a student's work, and she narked on him to the university chancellor. However, Lydia doesn't think Chris has anything to do with the sabotage, as he still lives in Chicago. By the way, today is the chat's grand opening, the event that everyone has been preparing for. The place is boppin'. Lydia seated another party of two in Nancy's area. "I know your cyber waitress, Nancy, will take good care of you." One of my favorite things this book does is wildly throw around the word cyber as an adjective at every opportunity. While Nancy's going about cyber waitressing, an arrogant-looking woman enters the cafe, who turns out to be Lydia's ex-boss, Ellen Dorman. "Well, Lydia, this little shop of yours is so sweet." The woman brushed her cropped, bleach blonde hair off her cheek. "But you left me in the lurch, you know, and I'm here to remind you of your obligation to—" "I have no obligation, Ellen," Lydia hotly interrupted. "Not to you or anyone else." "Wow," George exclaimed. "What a—" "Suspect," Nancy finished George's sentence. George was this close to raising this book's age rating. A man who looked like Paul Bunyan loomed over the hostess desk, wringing the rim of his 10-gallon hat. This is Rick Henry, the owner of the PC Corral, if you hadn't guessed. In a booming, scratchy voice, he shouted, "I'm sick of your threats, ya hear? Nobody threatens Rick Henry." Mr. Henry is claiming that he also got a threatening email, which he traced to the chat. However, when Nancy explains that they've also been getting threatening emails, he comes around very quickly. Sorry I came on so strong, but you understand, when these computers go down, I get a little crazy. Mighty nice place you have here, Rick Henry added as he put on his hat. I keep having to remind myself that Mr. Henry's not talking about a 10-acre cattle ranch in Texas. He's talking about an internet cafe in a bougie neighborhood in Santa Monica. Mr. Henry is hands down my favorite character in the book. I love how he talks like he's in a 1950s Western movie, but with 90s computer lingo peppered in. How would you like to make our competition a little more interesting? What do you mean? Lydia asked. The PC Corral challenges the chat to a zero-dust tournament. We don't have as big a crowd, but I think we can scrape together a team by tonight. What do you say? Lydia glanced at Andy and Nancy. You're on, she answered. It'll be fun and great for business. Rick Henry shook Lydia's hand. He and Lydia decided to pitch in $50 each to buy a trophy for the winning team. For the cafe who's pouring coffee to the smartest computer geeks this side of the Mississippi, Mr. Henry said. You can nickname the prize the Dweeb, Nancy said. The Dweeb? That's really mean, Nancy. She's feeling all superior just because she gets regular doses of vitamin D. That night, at 8 o'clock, the chat team logged on to the Zero Dust website. Wait, they're just holding the tournament tonight? They're not going to maybe prepare it all or set up an advertising campaign to build hype and gather publicity for both cafes or anything like that? The goal of the game was to be the first team to secure the treasure and get it back to its own website, earning points along the way for successfully repelling deadly attacks from the opposing gamers. Each team was to seek clues to identify the treasure's location while avoiding traps, blockades, and false evidence left by the opponent. I have literally no idea how to visualize this game or how the gameplay works, but that's fine. As a throng of fans cheered the gamers on, Nancy noticed a familiar, but still mysterious face in the crowd. Ellen Dorman. Where did this crowd of fans come from? The cafe just opened today, and they didn't have time to drum up publicity for the event. My best guess is that they're just random people they enticed in from the street with the promise of a free coffee or something. Whoever cheers the loudest gets a free muffin. I've had enough of these childish games. Ellen stood up, visibly seething with so much anger that she almost toppled the table. I hope all of your dreams go up in smoke, just as mine have. She left, slamming the door behind her. There's an awkward silence after Ellen leaves, and then a quick-thinking George broke the stillness. I guess she had one too many German chocolate double espresso lattes. Ha-ha! Good one, George! By the end of the night, the chat was winning Zero Dust by 30 points. They haven't told me enough about Zero Dust for me to be able to tell whether that's a good score or not. Is 30 points a lot, or are they just barely ahead? After everyone leaves, Nancy asks Lydia about Ellen Dorman. Lydia and Chris Toth both worked for Ellen's company, Highwire. Ellen hired Chris and me for a sensitive project. What do you mean by sensitive? Nancy asked. Ellen wanted us to come to California to create viruses. Ellen was on her way up in the company and needed a successful marketing plan. Hers just happened to include releasing viruses in promo material that only Highwire software could then wipe out. So when people opened the free software, their computer would eventually contract a virus. This is terrifying to me because it sounds scarily plausible. Once Lydia realized what Ellen wanted her to do, she quit, but Ellen doesn't want to let her go. You know, because she's in California, where it's really hard to find people with technological skills who have zero moral scruples if it means they'll be making a lot of money. Interestingly, Andy mentions that he also worked for Ellen in the past. The next day, they head to the chat for another profitable day of cyber barista-ing and boot up the computers. Each monitor flickered to life and displayed the usual hard drive scan data. Unexpectedly, a frightening graphic of a skull and crossbones popped into view. Then, one by one, each screen filled with a mushroom cloud explosion. The speakers on PC number 1 thundered. The kaboom echoed throughout the cafe, tumbling from one computer to the next. Nancy spun around and saw the image of a fiery shockwave radiate from all the monitors. "What's happening?" Bess cried out. "It's a virus!" Andy yelled, and pounded a keyboard, trying to stop the chain reaction. But the virus spread like lightning over the entire network, infecting every computer running. Okay, I know what this hacker is doing is destructive and bad, but can I just say, they've got style. Andy accuses Mr. Henry of setting off the virus, suggesting that Mr. Henry might have emailed the virus to the chat. I may not know a lot about technology, but I'm pretty sure someone would have had to click a link in that case. You can't just email viruses directly into someone's inbox, right? Maybe Andy got a link to sexy cyber cowgirls in your area or something like that. It turns out the virus really did come via email and was sent from the PC Corral. Nancy asks about the chat's antivirus software, and apparently it was disabled by someone in the cafe. Why do customers have the ability to do that? Maybe they should focus on upping their security instead of hosting esports tournaments. Nancy and Lydia head over to the PC Corral with their torches and pitchforks, only to find out that Mr. Henry has also been affected by a virus. At least, he would have been if he hadn't had high-wire antivirus software. On the way back to the chat, Nancy mentions that she's very suspicious of Andy. She asks, "How much do you really know about him?" Enough to know that he'd never get mixed up with hacking again. He used to be a hacker? Nancy and Bess have another fight about Andy, and Bess storms out. Poor Bess. Everyone always talks about Y2K, but no one ever asks if you're Y2OK. Cut to 9 hours later, and Bess still hasn't returned. George and Nancy are getting worried and decide to go out and look for Bess. Andy, on the other hand, is too busy with these computers to go, which is rich, considering that Bess's undying loyalty to him is the reason she's missing in the first place. Like, the girl who would sacrifice long-term friendships for you is missing, and you're not even gonna look up from your computer? Bess deserves so much better. They decide to check the alley in which Nancy was attacked back in Chapter 2. While George stands guard, Nancy discovers a small door in the wall, which leads to a crawl space which smells like that musty, spicy scent. Once inside, something crunched beneath her foot. Nancy shined her light down. "My locket," she said softly. "Crunched? What is the locket made out of? Potato chips?" Wow. Ned's even cheaper than I thought. Then, Nancy is whacked in the stomach by a 2x4. All Nancy could think as she tumbled to the crawl space floor was, "Here I go again!" Nancy grabbed hold of a long, silky ponytail and pulled it. Her attacker let out a distinctive scream. A familiar scream, Nancy thought. She suddenly realized she was in hand-to-hand combat with her best friend. Bess and Nancy entering into hand-to-hand combat was inevitable at some point, really. Bess apparently went looking for clues in the crawl space in an attempt to absolve Andy, but soon after she entered, another person came in and she had to hide. The person sat in the crawl space reading for hours. But when they finally left, Bess was ready. "I was so scared he would see me, I squeezed my eyes shut as he passed by." "You did what?" Nancy asked, shocked that Bess had missed an opportunity to identify the person who was probably behind the chat's sabotage, not to mention that he or she was probably Nancy's own assailant. "You could have seen who it was if you had just left your eyes open," she said, exasperated. Anyway, Bess's only impression of this person is that they have big poofy hair. I think there's a real missed opportunity for some additional tension here if Nancy suspected that Bess was lying to her, as big poofy hair is the exact opposite of Andy's greasy, lanky hair. In the suspect's nest, Nancy and Bess find a pile of newspapers. In one of them, a classified ad is circled. "Wait person needed. Must be cyber smart." When they go to leave, they discover a small bottle. It was a brand of men's cologne called Savage. Bess laughed. "I've gotta smell this." She unscrewed the tiny lid and took a whiff. Nancy recognized the spicy scent of her assailant and quickly pushed the bottle away. Number one thing you shouldn't forget to bring with you to your top secret sabotage hideout: cologne. Back upstairs in the chat, Andy has a confession to make. I had a little run-in with the law a couple of years back for some hacking I'd done, but I knew right away that getting famous by trashing other people's systems wasn't for me. Ellen had heard of me from an underground network of hackers in Chicago and contacted me to do some work for Highwire. I wanted to go straight, so I came here to LA. It didn't take me long to figure out that going straight and working for Ellen at Highwire Industries weren't exactly the same thing. Yeah, maybe the fact that Ellen has ties to an underground network of hackers should have clued you into that. Ellen wanted Andy to finish Lydia's virus, but Andy quit. Nancy goes to confront Ellen about the sabotage and mentions Andy. Ellen says, "I suggest you ask him about his own history of cyber pranks." I need you to know that cyber pranks is written as one word. If I influence you to do one thing, please let it be to use cyber pranks more often in your day-to-day vocabulary. Ellen doesn't have much to say, but she does let it slip that she was out for dinner with a friend from Chicago the other night. Nancy then heads to the PC Corral. Nancy noticed that the PC Corral had fewer customers than the last time she was there. Maybe the chat cafe really was hurting Rick Henry's business. Who wouldn't want to go to a Western-themed internet cafe where the customers sit in a literal corral? Nancy asked to look at the PC Corral's email logs. "Be my guest, little lady. The sooner we nab that rascal, the sooner we can get on with commerce." That's my intention, Mr. Henry," Nancy said. "Yes, sirree, I'm counting on that zero-dust tourney to pull in a few bucks for my place. By the way, have you logged on to the chat's website lately?" "Not since Sunday," Nancy said. "Why?" "Your boss sure has a funny way of running the show," he said. "You may want to mosey over to your site before you check my log." So Nancy moseys on over to the website. Nancy clicked on the What's Up icon, thinking she would jump to a calendar of events. Instead, she gaped at a hideously grinning face. Framing the face in very bold type flashed the words, "Lydia, go home." Hysterical laughter cackled. Nancy sat there, stunned and staring at the chilling screen. Then she remembered what Andy had taught her: view the source code. She popped an alternate window onto the screen. Sure enough, within the first dozen lines of code, Nancy found the brackets that Andy had told her about. The brackets allowed authors to write comments about the webpage that would remain unseen by the cyber surfer. Nancy saw these words in the brackets: Ophir, Monday, 7th December. Andy arrives and he and Nancy search for Ophir in the email log, eventually finding a draft email they composed. "Achoo! It's virus time again, chat folks. Better watch who tastes your Wednesday brew. For those who do will fall to the flu." And yep, today is Wednesday. Nancy and Andy stared at the screen. This time the virus isn't electronic, Nancy said excitedly. It's biological. Nancy is way too excited by biological terrorism. But there's no time to lose. Nancy runs out of the room, yelling, "We've got to stop the chat cafe from serving that poisoned coffee!" Because of stupid contrived reasons, the phone at the PC Corral isn't working, so Nancy and Andy take to the streets until they find an available public phone. Isn't modern technology convenient? Nancy calls the chat and tells them to throw away the coffee, and that's that. We never learn if it was actually poisoned or not. Nancy does have to shout to make herself heard, as the payphone is right near a busy road and a boy with a bell on it. "That's it!" She slammed the receiver down and raced back to Andy. Nancy knew who was behind the sabotage. I love how Nancy's light bulb moment is indicated by the very literal symbol of a ringing bell. Nancy bursts into the chat and announces, "Chris Toth's our guy." "Oh," Lydia gasped. "He's in Chicago." "I can't explain now," Nancy said. "There's no time. Just know that somebody who called himself Ophir wrote an email message that threatened to put a virus into the chat's Wednesday brew." Oh my god, Ophir? Like Chris Topher. This book is the smartest dumb book I've ever read, and I love it. Nancy goes into Lydia's office to phone the police and smells the familiar scent of Old Spice. She could have called the police from the payphone, but then the book would have ended too quickly. Nancy Drew Files books have to be strictly 150 pages. Nancy was about to attack her assailant with a jab of her elbow and a body-flipping maneuver, but in a split second he had made his move. Oh, was she? Nancy's attacker ties her up and tosses her into Lydia's closet. Lydia comes into the office, and yep, the attacker is Chris, and he confronts Lydia. But Chris, Lydia implored, I did what I had to do. Don't you understand that? No, you did what you wanted to do, Toth shouted. I didn't just help Andy, I made him brilliant. That software he developed is partly mine. Without my guidance, he couldn't have pulled it together. No. Chris would be making AI-generated images in 2023 and calling himself an artist. Toth leaned forward. His piercing voice spewed hatred. You ruined my life, Lydia! Then Chris pulls a gun on Lydia, because that's an easy way to create tension and stakes in a scene which doesn't have any. Unfortunately, I think this climax is the weakest part of the book, as Nancy isn't really directly involved with it until the very last minute when she springs out of the closet and hurls her gagged and bound body at Chris. Lydia picks up the gun and they call the police and tie Chris and the conflict up neatly. Reasons why this climax is bad. 1, it's mostly just people talking about something that has no relevance to Nancy while she just sits in the closet and watches them like it's an episode of Seinfeld. 2, the conflict could have been resolved without Nancy's presence. Yes, Chris has a gun and he's threatening Lydia, but what he really wants is for Lydia to join him and work for Ellen again. Lydia could pretend to agree, and then they would have to walk out the only exit to the room through the cafe where all the employees and customers are while Chris is swinging a gun around. It would be pretty obvious that something was amiss, and even if they couldn't do anything to stop Chris, they would have at least have had the opportunity to phone the police. Nancy breaks down what led her to realize the culprit was Chris. That Ellen mentioned meeting a friend from Chicago, that she just happened to make a phone call from the same booth that he did, that Ofer is short for Christopher and not Gopher like George suggests it is. Get it together, George. You're supposed to be the smart one. You're the brunette, for goodness sake. Nancy also conjectures that Chris has been living in the walls this whole time, or at very least, the crawl space under the floor. Even creepier, he made little holes in the floor so he could eavesdrop on everything happening at the chat. Lydia said, This turn-of-the-century flooring is made from pine planks. I assumed some kind of worm had bored through them. A worm did, Bess said. Chris Toth! Chris's motivation was just to win back Lydia, but whether that's for professional or romantic reasons, the book doesn't clarify. Thank God they thwarted the villain just in time for the continuation of the esports tournament. But uh-oh, the chat is losing. Andy took control of the mouse. I'm driving! In one swift move, he saved the chat team from ruin and entrapped the PC Corral. Chat fans roared. We have to grab the treasure that's in one of these 3 different chests, but I can't figure out which one. If we open the wrong chest, then the PC Corral wins. Nancy asked the team to give her a rundown of the clues. Listening carefully, she ticked off the clues in her head as the seconds ticked by. In a matter-of-fact way, she calmly said, Chest number 3. The crowd stirred. Some scoffed at Nancy's choice and threw their hands up into the air. Andy looked up at Nancy and winked. Boys and girls, he said, don't second-guess the master. 30 seconds remained on the countdown clock when Andy clicked on treasure chest number 3. Yes, the gamers cried. She did it! Virtual horns hooted, sirens sounded, and the monitor flashed triumph for the chat cafe. The cyber celebration was nothing compared to the real-life cheering. Everybody clapped. The end. Crime at the Chat Cafe is a ridiculous book. It uses and abuses the word cyber, it relies much too heavily on coincidence, it leaves half its subplots unresolved, and I love it so much. I think this book is a fitting conclusion to the Nancy Drew Files series, as it's just an epitome of what I love about those books. The situations are all really zany and a 40-year-old woman's idea of teenage cool. The stakes are either sky high or absurdly low, but treated with an equal amount of drama. And there's a lot of romantic angst, which doesn't feature in the original series, in which Nancy and Ned's relationship is as sanitized as the start of the pandemic. There's a real lack of interpersonal drama and tension in the main series of Nancy Drew books, which, although comforting, is not exactly interesting. But the Nancy Drew Files gave us that tension and drama. There's a reason this is my favorite series of Nancy Drew books. Let's all take a moment of silence to mourn the death of the Nancy Drew Files.